Good afternoon, everyone, and happy that you were able to join us today. The webinar that is being hosted by Latin American Investment Banking. We're an investment banking boutique based in Miami that focus in M&A transaction and capital raising in the Americas. Today webinar, Latin America 2025, Growth, Challenge, and Change, will focus on opportunities and challenge for the region, for the future of the region. We will be touching, of course, the new U.S. administration, impact in the region, the tension with China, and the potential effect in Latin America. And certainly, we will be speaking about some specific countries that may have some impact for the rest of the region. It's a pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, John Price. John is a managing director of Latin America's Market Intelligence, and he has more than 30 years experience in advising companies on organization across the region. John is one of the most, from my point of view, one of the most respected analysts of economic, political, and social landscape. John, happy to have you again. And could you please expand a little bit on your background and AMI, services in the region, please?
Great. Well, Alessio, first of all, many thanks to you, to Roberto for the invitation, to Leonardo, your tech wizard behind the scenes in Bogota, who's helped put this all together. This is, I think, the second or third time we've collaborated together on these webinars, and I really appreciate the trust and partnership. Just a little bit about AMI. We've been around previously under the name of Info Americas before we sold to Kroll, and then pulled away from Kroll about 14 years ago, 2011, under the brand America's Market Intelligence. We are here to help companies make decisions. Those decisions range from which country to enter next or expand their offering, which services and products to next launch, with whom they should partner, where should they or how should they allocate their marketing budgets next year. All of these marketing-facing decisions typically require input from three external sources of intelligence. One of those is the customer, including potential customers and what they think of your product, your service, this acquisition you're going to make. That's, of course, market research. And then anticipating how the competition might react or how strong they are and where they're vulnerable, as well as what they do best and what might therefore be emulated by them. That is competitive intelligence. And then the third area, which is much of what we're discussing today, is the business context in which our clients, your clients, operate. That is the political, regulatory, and economic environment in which their business ideas have to work. And so we study those three externalities, and then we help advise companies on what measures to take specifically, with whom to partner, in what country, how to, with what channel partners, all of these decisions that come after moving forward with your investment. So thank you for that. That's what we do. And you can always explore our site, read what we publish, learn more about us at americasmi.com.
Thank you very much, John. For your information, this webinar has been recording, and we will be distributing after to all the participants in case that you wanted to review one more time or distribute it as well. We also are going to have a Q&A session at the end, but please feel free to input your information and your question as soon as you have it ready. We have prepared a couple of basic questions to initiate the discussion with John. The first one is certainly related with the new administration in the U.S. Is going to change the way that the U.S. has been related with the region, and specifically how the U.S.-China relation is going to impact Latin American governments and companies operating in the region. Um, John, in addition, the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is he recognized the importance of China in the region, and he's been an advocate of political changes in some countries. Could you please let us know your ideas and what you expect for 2025 and potentially for the near future? I know it's a very difficult question at this point because many things has been changing in the last week or so with the new administration.
Well, you're absolutely right, Alessio. The Trump administration, Marco Rubio, have been unequivocal in declaring to the world that they are going to redesign American foreign policy through the lens of a China containment, if not, pushing China back away from certain markets. But this is not exactly a Trump invention. This has been a growing. We've been moving towards this declaration. Perhaps Trump's more confrontational style has brought it into loud, sounding sound bites and leading off any discussion on foreign policy with his position vis-a-vis China. But if you think about it, the U.S. foreign policy is really driven by three strategic interests. One is the political class, be it a government led by Democrats or Republicans. And they get their ideas, they get their sense of concerns from often think tanks and others who study these issues over the longer period of time. And those think tanks, many of them in the United States, have been sounding alarm bells about China for a long time. Likewise, U.S. military interests, the U.S. military itself, has been sounding alarms about China's growing capabilities in terms of its Navy and in terms of its air power and the rate at which it's equipping and modernizing its armed forces. But the third pillar is the one that's really changed its mind very recently, and that's the U.S. corporate interests. U.S. corporations have been reticent to criticize China and been reticent to lobby the U.S. government to work against China because they were always holding out in the hopes of being able to crack open the Chinese market, the second largest market in the world for certain products, the largest market in the world for other products. But the reality is that most American companies, in fact, most foreign companies, have failed to penetrate the Chinese market in any significant way because the Chinese have been able to create domestic competitors very quickly. They've changed the rules of play once companies are in there that have made it more difficult for foreign companies to compete in China. And so the U.S. corporate sector has come to the conclusion that China is now more of a threat to them in markets, not necessarily in the U.S., but in markets that the U.S. has excellent penetration, including Latin America. China is more of a threat to them there than it is an opportunity to sell their own products and services in China. And so that is what's really changed. And we see this, that this is not just a military and strategic interest, this is a commercial interest as well. And for that reason, this is a global change in U.S. policy, but it is felt very severely in Latin America. In terms of what we're seeing specifically in Latin America, we're seeing this, or how the Americans are really concerned about China in several areas. One is Panama. Now, there's a lot of rhetoric out there that says the Chinese control Panama or control the port. That's an exaggeration, but given the momentum of Chinese investments in Panama, it is not incredible to say that 5 years from now, the Chinese might be in a position to clog the canal. And that would leave half of the U.S. military naval assets in the Atlantic Ocean unable to access a Pacific theater of war. And the Americans anticipate eventually a war being fought over Taiwan. The second area is the fact that the Chinese have invested in 40 ports between the Caribbean and Latin America. Now, keep in mind that a typical port will have multiple terminals and multiple port operators. So it's very rare that a single port operator controls all of a port. There are a few cases like Shanghai and Peru where that's the case, but most of the time it's shared. But nonetheless, a Chinese either port operator or Hong Kong-owned port operator like Hutchison Whampoa having access to all of the data related to imports and exports coming through maritime ports in a country gives them a level of access to information that makes the Americans uncomfortable. There are other areas, including supply chain, and I think we're going to be talking about Mexico and NAFTA, so I'll wait on that. But that's another area of concern in terms of Chinese involvement. And another really important area is critical minerals, and the fact that Latin America is endowed with a lot of rare earths, but especially copper and lithium. And the Chinese and the Americans and others are all seeking to secure those supplies, because the real war in the future is the war over innovation. Who controls quantum innovation and the ability to essentially survey the population through digital products, ranging from electric vehicles to our phones to others. And this is really where the model of globalization is at risk, and where there's a strong pull both by the Americans and the Chinese to bifurcate those supply chains. And that goes all the way down to critical minerals, which are held en masse in Latin America.
Great, thank you. John, I think you already touched on our next point, and is the relation between the US and Mexico. It's probably one of the largest trade bilateral relation. I think Mexico is the largest partner to the US, and there are several manufacturing supply chains that connect to Mexico. The stance of Trump with Mexico indicate that he's been a little bit aggressive, I would call it, treating to impose tariff in 2 days, in February 1st, 25%, not just Mexico, but also Canada. And I understand also that publicly there has been some discussion in anticipation of the renegotiation of the trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. So I guess Mexico is one of the key countries for the region, and also key for the US, that it may be significantly impacted by new policies affecting exported and investors. I mean, there are many companies, US companies, that have moved their operation to Mexico because of the proximity, the connection, and the opportunity to be more competitive, and also to outsource some of the operation from other countries, including China, to the country, to Mexico. So how disruptive you think that will be this situation, and what you anticipate, not just for the next few months, but for the next year and a half, when these trade agreement need to be renegotiated?
Well, I think everyone was caught a little off guard, not just by the threats, but by the fact that they rushed the timetable to implement new tariffs to 2 days from now, February 1st, on Saturday. And that seemed, incredulous. Nobody thought it was even sort of technically feasible. Most people assumed that Trump would come out and would negotiate hard and would threaten, carry a big stick and threaten loudly with it. But it appears that he chose Mexico and Canada for a good reason, and that is that both countries are in political transition. The Sheinbaum administration is still getting its its bearings as the new government in Mexico, particularly the Mexican embassy in Washington. Now, Mexico always had one of the most talented embassy staff and trade leadership teams in Washington. AMLO essentially lost all those people by cutting their salaries and dismissing them. And so Sheinbaum is quickly calling back these old experts who were very capable of counterpunching the Americans whenever they were in a nativist mood in the past. But that takes time, and that takes negotiating with these people. And so Mexico has been ill prepared and still hasn't put together, I think, a very comprehensive series of options as to how they will respond if, in fact, U.S. tariffs go up February 1st. And the Canadians, of course, Trudeau's on his way out. His finance minister's quit because she's going to run for his position. The other leaders in the cabinet, I suppose that Minister Jolie, the foreign minister, has been somewhat forceful and taken the lead on this. But again, they've come up with a series of countermeasures. They'll start with tariffs on 3 or 4 products: orange juice out of Florida, steel out of several Midwestern states, dishwashers, interestingly enough, out of Wisconsin. But they're holding back a lot of their gunpowder to see exactly how far Trump goes on February 1st. But this is a different level of tactic. Instead of holding back this big shotgun, he's going ahead and shooting it, and then basically going to negotiate from a position where, okay, I've caused you pain. If you want less pain, I will pull back these tariffs in response to concessions. What's unclear is what he wants from the Canadians. What is a little clearer is what he wants from Mexico. He wants 3 things. He wants Chinese companies out of the supply chain that makes its way into U.S. markets. So the automotive, electronics, aviation, etc. There are some legitimate gripes there. There's plenty of rumors abound. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence to suggest that part of the migration of Chinese companies to Mexico over the last few years included the purchase illegally of false certificates of origin that allow these Chinese products to enter under USMCA local content. And those certainly ought to be audited and sniffed out. But Americans want Mexico to go further and really get rid of as many as possible Chinese suppliers and substitute them with Mexican suppliers. That's a little more difficult to do without breaking its own national laws. The other thing they want to do is stop the flow of non-Mexicans who use Mexico as a conduit to go into the U.S. And there's certainly there's a big, evidence of that. That's come down already over the last year, but Sheinbaum's really made an effort in the last 60 days to really squeeze that. And then the third, of course, is the movement of fentanyl and other drugs out of organized criminal organizations in Mexico into the U.S. market. He would like to see that stop. Very difficult to do. We've seen some high-profile arrests, but let's face it, you've got a country addicted to drugs. You have a country where organized crime has massive influence in at least half of the states in Mexico. Very difficult to win any kind of war on drugs. But those are the 3 things that Trump has been pretty clear in declaring he wants Mexico to deal with. What for him represents success versus not enough, he's yet to declare.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And certainly Mexico is a key country for the region and may define, what is the policy with some other countries in Latin America. Going a little bit south to Argentina, has been an interesting development with President Milei. What do you expect for Argentina economy for this year, and what could be the impact of Milei, hopefully success or failure in the region? Because I think his policies and his dramatic change still ongoing process may be used by some other potential government or political party to follow his policies. So what about Argentina? And again, we will be touching some other countries, but I think Argentina is one of those key countries that is also, I would say, Salvador as well with Bukele, but it's a smaller country and has had less publicity compared to Milei, no?
No, absolutely. I think, 3 months ago, I wasn't sure about Milei's experiment because that's when the belt tightening was really, really hurting the average Argentine. And I think the average Argentine couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And Milei leads a small party and therefore relies on political allies to maintain his support for his reforms. He has faced opposition, obviously, from unions. He's faced opposition from the Peronists. He's faced opposition from the courts, which are loaded with Peronist selected judges. And it looked really touch and go. Now you're starting to see progress. You're starting to see small scale investment in Argentina. You're starting to see business owners feeling more confident. You're seeing investment going into Vaca Muerta and to mining projects, which will generate divisa, will generate dollars, which is desperately needed. There's a couple of key points ahead. Number one is the ability of Milei to convince creditors to roll over Argentine debt. I think Donald Trump could lend a hand in that regard by browbeating those lenders, something that presidents in the past certainly would not do, but I think he will do that for Milei. The other is removing capital controls and allowing the currency to float. And that will open the door to billions of dollars of hedge fund investments and other institutional investors who would like to buy Argentine assets listed on the stock exchange or Argentine paper, but are prohibited by their own governance from doing so when there's capital controls around the currency. So when that is removed, and I think it will be over the next 3 to 4 months, then that will be for me the straw that breaks the camel's back, and really we can see a clear mandate for Milei. We can see a change, not just politically, but in the system, the economic system of Argentina, and hopefully put us behind us decades of dysfunction of Peronist governments who have just robbed that country of so much of its inherent wealth. And that's an exciting proposition, not just for Argentina, but as you point out, for rekindling a sort of libertarian spirit in Latin American politics, which could definitely have an impact in Chile, in Colombia, in Brazil, even in Mexico, where future governments take an axe to government graft, to government overspending, further privatize their economies, break competitions in the private sector, and really unleash the potential of Latin America. So it is an exciting and pivotal moment, not just for Argentina, but for the region. And I think I hope that Milei has made that case to Trump so the Americans are behind him and behind Argentina's success, because it will have a domino effect positively on the region, I believe.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. And certainly Argentina is in a country with significant natural resources that give better chances to succeed and turn around the economy of the country. Yeah. John, we are approaching to the time, but hopefully we can answer one more, or you can answer for us one more question. And yeah, if the audience can stay, we will be happy to answer some of the question that has been posted on the chat. I think I read somewhere a Financial Times editor that said that it's easy and safe to be pessimist about Latin America. especially right now with so many uncertainty going on, especially with the new U.S. foreign policy. Why don't we look at the positive side and what are the big stories and opportunities that may attract investor and companies to the region in the short and medium term. And I may include somehow, some of the comment or question that I saw in the chat about, for the outsourcing of, services as well and products, Latin America seems to be well positioned for the US, not just Mexico, of course, because of the land connection, but the rest of the region. So I include something about, this idea that has been going on for the last few years about Latin American outsourcing, supplying to the US as part of this potential positive trend or opportunity.
Well, absolutely. Look, I think that most of the opportunities that you'll see in Latin America are the ones that don't rely a lot on a cooperative government. There are trends in Latin America. There are lots of private sector players in Latin America. There's lots of private sector demand in Latin America that is relatively immune to political interference, relatively immune to the interference of populism that definitely has taken grip in several Latin American countries. And one of those big trends is demographics. Latin America is their baseline growth is modest, but the more important thing is it's shifting. So it's getting older. Now, that has an immediate impact and has had a positive impact for almost 20 years of fewer children in a house means more money to be spent on discretionary items. And we've seen consumption outgrow growth, GDP growth now for about 20 years. And that will continue for about another 10 years. So that's great for anyone in the consumer space. But more specifically, the people over 60 years of age, that cohort of people is growing dramatically at 3 to 4 times the average population growth. And importantly, these people have money. Thanks to pension reforms going back 30 years, the poor in Latin America, the elderly in Latin America are no longer necessarily poor. It used to be that when you stopped working, you stopped earning, you had very few savings to count upon unless you were very wealthy. And as a result, you as a consumer fell off the radar. That's no longer the case. The elderly now have money, they have savings. They therefore, like all older people, spend a lot more on financial services, on healthcare, and on travel, being 3 areas. So anyone who's in those spaces and understands how to appeal to this market will have growth. Another one is e-commerce. Latin America has a very shallow formal retail footprint, and if you compare the square footage of formalized brick and mortar retail in Latin America, it's about 1/15 that of the United States. So, and as consumers have gotten more comfortable with e-commerce, thanks to COVID, they realize that they don't have to drive 3 hours to a big city to buy a certain product, maybe a book or an article of clothing or a unique athletic equipment. They can buy it online. They don't have to travel to Miami to make those purchases. They can buy them online. And so this is really changing the spending pattern, and we're seeing e-commerce within a couple of years over-indexing the U.S. in terms of penetrating of all retail. Part of that, along with AI, along with climate change, which is driving up the use of air conditioning, has doubled, if not tripled, the demand for electricity today versus 10 years ago. And Latin America doesn't have, in most of its countries, enough conventional energy supply to address that energy need. And so they're investing heavily in renewables, including storage, including transmission. There's a lot of obstacles still, a lot of bottlenecks caused mostly by a lack of government leadership on regulation, but the need is there, the opportunities are there. And one other thing is just healthcare in general. Healthcare is one of those sectors that will grow at about 10% a year for the next 30 years in Latin America. Not only are people aging and have money as elderly people, but sadly, highest rate of diabetes, some of the highest rate of chronic illness in the world. And the public sector health system cannot keep up, which means that people will spend through their own resources in private health, and that's where the growth is. And so people who provide equipment, services, pharmaceuticals will find this a very high growth market for the next 2 decades.
Thank you very much, John. I think we can go now to the Q&A session. Before that, some of the person in the audience may not be familiar with Latin American investment banking. Again, we are investment banking boutiques based in Miami that focus on M&A transaction and capital raising. We have received recently some interest of Latin American companies, of course, looking for opportunities in the U.S. to prepare to these potential, new tariff and trying to comply with the new government interest of moving production to the country. Some of the questions that we have been receiving, John, are specific for countries. I will select a few of them. Colombia recently, there was a situation past Sunday. What is your view about, the opportunities or challenge for Colombia? I know that has been resolved, but I'm sure that some other challenge will be coming in the near future for the country.
Well, I think that the tete-a-tete with Colombia was a opportunity that Trump really exploited to show to what lengths he's willing to go to get his way. I think Petro was naive in how he confronted Trump on that, and he got a big slap on the wrist as a result. Petro is relatively unpopular in Colombia, and so being heavy-handed with Colombia, as Trump was, did not result in Colombians falling in ranks in support of their president. On the contrary, it caused further political division and further criticism of Petro. And so that is part of the divide and conquer world that Trump wants to lead. This, in many ways, we're talking about a return to a mercantilist world where the protections of small and medium companies that come from our international institutions don't really serve the U.S. interests, and they'd rather a world where they can throw their weight around, which is a world that we saw in the 1920s before World War II and before the construction of the liberal global order with all these institutions that protect the flow of money, that protect international movement of people and money and the sovereignty of countries. So that, in many ways, it was really kind of a way of demonstrating to the world what the Americans will do. Given that, I don't see foreign investors being very excited about Colombia if their business model relies upon exports to the United States, or if their business model relies upon a strong Colombian peso, because both are at risk. So it does not bode well. And it shows also that Trump is not principled in how he picks his fights. He's choosing certain opponents because of what he wants from them or because of their own political leanings. And the political leanings of Petro are completely against that of Trump and his MAGA supporters. So we will see more activity like that directed at other countries who stand in the way of Trump getting what he wants.
Thank you. Another country that we receive a specific question is about Venezuela. I think the Venezuelan diaspora has been a big supporter of Trump, as we have experienced here in Miami, and there are some expectation about forcing a political change. What could happen? What is your view? What could be the position of the U.S. government, especially Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State?
It's a good question. I think this really speaks to two different sides of the Trump administration. On the one hand, there are those who do not recognize much distinction between Venezuelans versus any other group of immigrants who've arrived here into the United States illegally, and therefore would like, are focused on deportation and would like to find any means possible to round up and deport those people, starting with people who have been thrown in jail or have been arrested for some sort of crime, but going beyond that and looking for people and catching people who came into the country illegally. And maybe be willing to strike a grand bargain with Maduro, who everyone recognizes, stole the last election, and trade those people and the ability to send them back to Venezuela for greater access or the lowering of sanctions against Venezuela. Then there's Marco Rubio and others directly responsible for Latin America under him, who come from a political thinking of they were forced, or their families or forefathers were forced to flee countries that were left-wing and dysfunctional and went to the States. And they don't want anything. They don't want to strike any kind of bargain with Venezuela, with an undemocratic country that has traditionally gone back on its word. And so it remains to be seen who will win that argument. At this point, I would say that the Marco Rubios will win the argument, and there won't be a deal with Venezuela. Partly because it would look really bad if Trump is doing business with someone like Maduro. And secondly, because I don't think it's realistic to round people up. We're not a dictatorship. We're a democracy. People have legal rights. People live in sanctuary cities. There are ways to slow down the deportation process. And unless he's willing to break American laws to round those people up, I don't see a grand bargain with Venezuela going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you again. There is another question regarding Europe and specifically about Mercosur trade agreement with Europe, but I will expand that question about what role could Europe play with the region based on the current tension or potential tension with Latin America. Will be maybe that Europe will take advantage and try to get closer, as also European economies depend on raw materials and some specific product from the region.
It's a great question. There's the answer could go either way, but there's no question. This European Mercosur deal has been in the works for almost 20 years. The sticking point in the past has been the Brazilians. The sticking point in more recent years have been the Europeans, countries like Hungary, segments like the French farmers who don't want to be invaded by cheap Brazilian or Argentine agriculture. The European Union was came about because of the external threat to them of the Americans and the Russians. And it may actually be the external threat of Donald Trump taking away the U.S. market from Mercosur companies, taking away the U.S. market from European exporters. That might be what brings Europe and Mercosur finally together and pushes through this agreement. That might just be what was needed. I haven't heard anything come out of the Trump administration, but it certainly would behoove them to get in the way of that agreement going forward, to somehow jeopardize it from going forward, because that provides a source of strength that makes it harder a source of strength for both Europe and South America that makes it harder for Trump to pursue his own policies. But I do believe that the threat of Trump may actually bring the Europeans and Mercosur together finally.
Thank you. I hope we still have time for a couple of additional questions. I think your consulting firm also have some specialization with fintech, and there is a question regarding fintech, and is the growth of fintech industry in Latin America and how you see traditional banks adopting or adapting to this trend? And one specific additional comment in this question is about prevention in the payment sector, which, fraud is not just an issue in Latin America, but worldwide.
Well, it is a really interesting trend. When interest rates were low and capital was plentiful going back 6 years, fintechs had made enormous strides. A lot of fintechs came onto the scene in Latin America, particularly in Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia. And they were making inroads in certain niche areas where perhaps banks were underserving, particularly small and mid-sized clients. What you find today, ever since interest rates took a boost and the funding for venture capital really, really was strongly reduced back in 2023, since then you've found that the surviving fintechs who had enough financing and were able to pivot so they stopped burning cash, they have stopped expanding and focused on consolidating in their area of specialization. A lot of fintechs have decided to partner with banks, and it's a mutual thing. The fintechs need cash, and they need to develop a model that will make them profitable and not just increase their customer adoptions. And the banks need the innovation. They need the simplicity. They need more user-friendly tools to service their customers. So we're seeing a lot of fintechs being either purchased by or forming partnerships with banks. It gives the fintechs a brick and mortar platform to deal with customers through branches and banks. It gives the banks a more sophisticated user experience, a simpler user experience, a more digital user experience for its own customers. I think that we haven't seen a lot of financing going into new fintechs in the last couple of years, but that will start to happen again. There's still plenty of white space in the market between underserved customers and real customer needs that fintechs are in a good position to occupy. But there hasn't been a lot of capital willing to invest in that because of the interest rate environment. But I suspect that will change in the next couple of years.
Yeah. Also, as you mentioned, a little bit surprised that fintech hasn't disrupted, some of the market or have had more impact in some of the market, because the traditional bank has been slow to adapt and adopt technology. So yeah, we have seen, of course, new bank, but I'm sure that many other competitors will come up into the arena. Probably the last question is also about a country, Peru. I like a specific Peru about the relation with China, the new port. What are your? Peru has been always traditionally connected with Asia, and the idea of what is your view on Peru, which again they need to deal with this tension between China and the U.S. more directly because of this new port that is going to not just benefit or impact Peru, but is supposedly also being an port for the rest of the region.
That's right. Well, Chancay is an impressive port. It's state of the art. And what it does is it allows soybean from as far as, central and eastern Brazil to reach Chinese markets more competitively than, say, American soybean, or flaxseed more competitively than, say, Canadian flaxseed. And so it does lower the cost of transportation. Now, Chancay was offered to the Americans first, and the Americans turned it down. The Americans don't have a lot of globally competitive port operating companies. The biggest three in the world are Dubai Ports out of Dubai, PSC out of Singapore, and Hutchison Whampoa of Hong Kong. Within the remaining top 10, I think about 4 of them are mainland Chinese, and I think a couple from other parts of Asia. So the Americans are not players in international port operations, never have been. And as a result, it seems like, crying over spilt milk. There were 8 ports concessioned at the time of Chiang Kai, and 2 of them are American ports. Others are run by port operators from other countries. It's pretty diverse. Peru has been very careful to try to be unaligned with anybody and to keep its options open to everybody. They have a very diverse sourcing of their foreign direct investment. It includes Chinese, it includes a lot of American, Canadian, European, Korean, Japanese. So Peru and Chile and others are playing that way. Now, Peru, particularly under previous governments, did make themselves vulnerable to Chinese influence by accepting a lot of bilateral loans. The Chileans did not, the Peruvians did. And the Chinese used that as leverage to make sure that the Chinese companies are considered all the way through in the bidding process of, whatever government work there is, and other things. And so the Chinese have always viewed Peru as their beachhead in Latin America. You have the greatest concentration of Chinese, not only state-owned enterprises, but also Chinese private companies with their Peruvian headquarters and their Latin American headquarters based in Lima. And so now, is this a threat to the United States? That, I think, hasn't been properly proven in the sort of global public opinion. But there's no question that Peru receives a lot of investment and lending from China, but they are by no means ready to call themselves a colony of China.
Thank you very much. John, it's always a pleasure having you. There is such a valuable and insight information about the region. I'm really happy that you were able to join us. I wanted to thank you as well, the audience. If anyone wanted to expand on any of this topic, I'm happy to make an introduction or connect with John. I'm sure that some of the audience also, have direct contact with you. So I think it's just an initial discussion that have many other areas that we can expand. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. I think the people will be happy to maybe do something else, connecting with you directly and having a further discussion of any of these topics. I apologize with some of the questions that we were unable to answer, and we will try to answer them privately. So thank you again, John, and to the audience, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks so much, Alessio. Really appreciate the opportunity and the platform and your friendship and partnership. Thanks so much.
Thank you.